Welcome to my channel. Jane Seymour was Henry VIII's third wife and the mother of his son and heir, Edward VI, but you probably know her best as the woman who finally gave Henry the son he so desperately wanted, even if it cost her life. But there's more to Jane than meets the eye. When she entered the royal court at age 15, she was considered plain and even homely, but she had a sharp wit and a quiet strength that would become a major influence on the young king. While other women at court saw Henry as a monster, Jane recognized his humanity and treated him with kindness, which made her one of the few people he actually liked. She gave birth to Edward VI in October of 1537, but sadly, she died just 12 days later from complications. Though she didn't live long, her legacy did, and she is remembered as the only one of Henry's wives to give him a son and heir. For more royal mishaps, including more of Jane's story, stay tuned. Who was Jane Seymour? Jane Seymour was the third wife of Henry VIII and the mother of his only legitimate child, the future Queen Elizabeth I. But despite her royal status, she is often overlooked in history. Unlike Catherine Parr, Jane was not a strong personality and she really fades into the background of the Tudor court. She was, however, a very devoted mother to her son, the future Edward VI, and she was the only one of Henry's wives who actually gave him a legitimate heir. For that, she is known as the ninth wonder of the world. After giving birth to Edward, Jane became very ill and died. And because she was the only one of Henry's wives to die before him, he was free to marry again, which he did 6 more times. To learn more about Jane Seymour, stay tuned for more information. I'm very excited to share this first part of our brand new series all about Jane Seymour with you today. This is the first episode in a 4-part series where we will be exploring the life and times of Henry VIII's third wife. So do make sure you resubscribed so that you don't miss any of the episodes as they come out over the next few weeks. This series is going to take us into the beautiful county of Wood. We'll explore Jane's family home, the stunning, as well as other locations around the county which feature heavily in her story. And I can't wait for you to see it. So welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Arthur. I am a historian and I create content about the past in fun, engaging ways. In this series, we will be visiting Wiltshire to explore the life and times of one of Henry VIII's wives, Jane Seymour. We will uncover what life was like for her as she grew up in Wiltshire, how she came to marry Henry, and finally what happened to her after his death. So do make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the episodes. In this episode, we will start at the beginning, tracing Jane's lineage back through the ages and seeing how her family rose to prominence in the county of Wiltshire. We will then travel to Wiltshire to see where Jane spent much of her childhood and explore her family's sprawling estate. Jane Seymour had the good fortune to be born into a very wealthy and well-connected family. Her father, Sir John Seymour, belonged to an ancient lineage of English nobles who had produced many high-ranking officers in the English army. Jane's great-great-grandfather, Sir John Seymour, had been knighted by King Henry VII at the Battle of Boar's Field in 1485. He was rewarded for his support of the king during the battle with the title Baron Seymour of Trowbridge and the estate of Emperor. His son, Sir Edward Seymour, became a member of Parliament and served as Sheriff of Wiltshire and of Middle. And his son, Sir John Seymour, was the father of Jane Seymour. Sir John Seymour was knighted in 1529 and given the hereditary title of Baron Seymour, and he died in 1536 when Jane was just 15 years old, leaving his widow Elizabeth and his children, Jane, John, and Margaret, to run the family estate while he was away. You see, Sir John was appointed as one of the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber to the young King Henry VIII, a position which took him away from home a lot of the time. And while he was gone, his eldest daughter, Jane, acted as the head of the household. The Seymour family lived in a number of different houses across Wiltshire and Somerset, but their main home was Wolf Hall near the village of Codford in southwest Wiltshire. It was here that Jane would have spent much of her childhood, and where she would have been cared for by her mother and her grandmother, Margaret Wentworth. However, when Sir John died, his widow Elizabeth and her 3 children moved in with relatives, leaving Wolf Hall largely empty. This is because the Seymours were in a bit of a financial crisis. Sir John had died without making a will, and as a result, his estate had to be heavily taxed before it could be divided among his heirs. This left Elizabeth struggling to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. But thankfully, help was at hand in the form of Jane's uncle, Edward Seymour, Bishop of London. Edward had been one of the key figures in the English Reformation, having broken with the Pope in Rome and instead made a pilgrimage to Canterbury to swear allegiance to the newly proclaimed supreme head of the Church of England, King Henry VIII. He had been rewarded for his loyalty to the king with the Bishopric of London, one of the richest church positions in the country. Now, ever mindful of the poverty of his sister and her children, Edward used some of his ill-gotten gains to buy back Wolf Hall from the taxman, gifting it to his sister and her family to live in. This meant that Jane and her siblings could return to the house where they had grown up and live comfortably once more. It also meant that Jane was only a stone's throw away from one of the most important men in England, her uncle Edward, the Bishop of London. In fact, Wolf Hall was just 2 miles away from his house, which was also in common. Now, I'm not suggesting that Jane was living in poverty prior to her uncle's intervention, but even if that were the case, Her situation was certainly far from ideal for Jane's future. Moving back to the family home in Wolf Hall was perfect timing. She would have been able to resume her life there as normal, studying with tutors and enjoying the comforts of a grand country estate. Life at Wolf Hall would have been full of luxury. Jane would have been waited on by servants, had access to the latest fashions, and would have enjoyed hunting trips and hawking with her brother. It was a privileged existence, and one that prepared her perfectly for the life which lay ahead of her. However, life at Wolf Hall wasn't just comfortable and carefree. Jane's father, Sir John Seymour, had been a staunch supporter of the reigning monarch, King Henry VIII, and following his death his widow Elizabeth and his children were expected to follow in his footsteps. This meant that while Jane might have been able to enjoy the comforts of her family home, she would have also been aware of the precarious nature of her family's position. One wrong move and she and her family could lose everything. This pressure to perform and behave in a way which was pleasing to the king would have been a constant in Jane's life, and something which would ultimately lead to her downfall. Unfortunately, no trace of Wolf Hall remains today. All that is visible now is a large earthwork mound on the site where it once stood. However, not far from Wolf Hall, hidden down a track and surrounded by trees, is another house which still stands. This is Sturhead, once the seat of the Seymour family. Sturhead is a beautiful National Trust property which was created in the 18th century by the Seymour family, but it was built on the site of an earlier house which had belonged to Jane Seymour's family. Now, if you look at the gardens, you can see that they are laid out in a style which is typical of the 16th century. This means that we can get an idea of what the gardens surrounding the house might have looked like in Jane's day. In fact, the whole estate gives us a wonderful idea of what life might have been like in Tudor England, and it's well worth a visit. If you want to find out more about Jane Seymour, then I'd highly recommend paying a visit to this amazing house and its gardens. It's a beautiful place and really does make you feel like you've stepped back in time. Thank you so much for watching this first episode in our mini-series all about Jane Seymour. If you enjoyed it, then please do leave me a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. In the next episode, we'll be exploring Jane's rise to Queen of England and uncovering the truth behind the myths and legends which surround her. So I hope you're looking forward to that. Until next time, take care and remember to stay curious. Part 2. Entry into courtly life. When we last left off, Jane had just arrived at the English court with her mother and sister in the spring of 1529. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, and would serve her until the end of the year when she was transferred to serve the new queen, Anne Boleyn. In this time, Jane would have had many opportunities to meet members of the English nobility, while attending the queen and participating in courtly life. But how exactly did one become a lady-in-waiting? How did they dress? And what kind of duties did Jane have to perform? Let's delve deeper into this world and see how Jane got on at court. The exact date that Jane Seymour entered the service of Catherine of Aragon is not known, but it must have been shortly after her arrival in England, because she was present at court when Anne Boleyn arrived in November 1532. Upon her arrival, the party traveled to Greenwich Palace where the king and his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were staying. Catherine was residing at the time in Wiltshire, so Jane most likely joined her there before returning to London. This journey would have been made by barge along the River Thames, taking several days to complete the trip. The young ladies may have taken rooms in a local inn while traveling. Ladies-in-waiting were expected to travel with their employer, whether by road or river, and were responsible for assisting her in any way necessary, including driving the boat. If they were wealthy enough, the ladies could bring servants along to help them manage their household, which included someone to wait on them, another to pack their things, and a third to ride ahead and find lodgings for them. But if they were not rich, they would have to do all these tasks themselves. Given that Jane received a yearly salary of only £170, a very modest amount, it's likely that she didn't bring any servants with her, especially since both her mother and sister were living with her. So Jane would have had to pack up the household goods, look for lodging, and perhaps even drive the boat. No wonder she and her sister fell out over this arrangement. As recorded in a letter from Elizabeth to Mary in December, Elizabeth says she has had a long journey from the north of England, having to go backwards and forwards, meaning she traveled from north to south and back again, probably trying to keep up with Catherine's movements, and forwards and backwards, meaning she went from the front of the boat to the back and back again, trying to assist the queen in any way possible. Then she goes on to say, "I cannot be easy in my sickness, having always so many journeys by water, which agreeth not with my present weakness." It was expected that ladies-in-waiting would make some personal sacrifices for their employer. They had to be ready to drop everything and move at a moment's notice, often without warning, and sometimes they were required to share a room with other ladies who were also serving their mistress. This would have been a small price to pay for an education and experience that few women could get anywhere else, and Catherine's household was one of the best places to learn the skills needed to survive at court. For the next 9 months, Jane would have assisted Catherine as she went about her daily routine. Depending on the time of day, she may have helped the queen dress, held her canopy as she walked through the court, or simply waited nearby while Catherine went about her business. Ladies-in-waiting were expected to be educated, witty, and charming. They had to know how to read and write, play an instrument, dance and sing. They were the entertainment for the royals during their leisure time. The royal ladies worked hard to maintain their beauty and youthfulness, and part of their training included learning the art of applying cosmetics. In fact, Henry VIII had a particular fondness for beautiful women and was quite brazen in his approach towards them. Once he surprised enough Cleves by sending her a cream tart filled with cosmetics so that she could beautify herself before their meeting. This was not an uncommon gift for a lady-in-waiting to receive. Another lady-in-waiting to Anne Boleyn once complained that she couldn't afford nice clothes, to which Anne replied, "I will send her something presently that shall help her the more." And sure enough, later that day, a package arrived containing cosmetics. While it might seem petty today, these gifts were actually quite valuable. Women had to buy their cosmetics from traveling merchants who brought them over from France or Italy. They usually consisted of a face powder made from white lead or flour, rouge made from flowers or berries, and lip balm made from beeswax and rose oil. Jane may have been given such a gift by Catherine as a way of welcoming her into her service, or possibly by another lady-in-waiting who wanted to encourage her to join them in their social activities. In addition to their usual duties, ladies-in-waiting were required to accompany their mistress to church every Sunday, unless they had a legitimate reason to stay behind. Sometimes they were sent to represent their mistress at other religious services like On January 1533, Jane Seymour attended the baptism of Henry VIII's illegitimate son, Henry Fitz, along with ladies-in-waiting Elizabeth Seymour, Margaret Pole, and Dorothy Shaw. The entry in the register reads, Lady Jane Seymour, Mr. John Seymour, Lady Elizabeth Seymour, Mr. William Seymour, Lady Margaret Pole, Mr. Richard Pole, Lady Dorothy Shaw, Mistress Elizabeth Weston, and Master Thomas Bridge. Although the spelling of the names is sometimes questionable, it is interesting to see Jane's name written out fully rather than being abbreviated like it is in most other records. Perhaps she was considered more important than the others due to her close relationship with Catherine. Whatever the reason, this entry provides us with a rare glimpse into the life of a lady-in-waiting and shows how they were expected to be present at all times. By the end of January 1533, Catherine of Aragon had fallen out of favor with Henry VIII, and he was eager to move on. The annulment process had begun, and she was transferred to a house near Hampton Court. Her ladies-in-waiting stayed with her, providing much-needed emotional support during this difficult time. One of these ladies was Jane Seymour. In February, she signed a letter pleading with Pope Clement VII to reconsider his decision not to grant Henry an. It's not known why she signed it. As she was a Protestant and knew the Pope would never change his mind, it may have been because she felt loyal to the Queen and wanted to show her support. Or it could have been because she was pressured to do so by another lady-in-waiting. Whatever the reason, it shows that Jane was willing to stand by Catherine's side no matter what happened. On May 23, 1533, Catherine's ladies-in-waiting were summoned to Windsor Castle to receive their new mistress, Anne Boleyn. The ceremony took place in St. George's Hall, and each lady-in-waiting had to kneel before Anne and swear loyalty to her. Afterwards, they were given badges with the letter A on them, and the French crown jewels to wear in their hair. Jane Seymour, along with Margaret Pole and Elizabeth Blount, were chosen to help her out of the carriage and escort her into the castle. From that day on, Jane's life at court changed dramatically. She was now working for a much younger, more ambitious queen who had no intention of being overshadowed by her ladies-in-waiting. Anne was determined to modernize the court and make it more like that of France, and she expected her ladies to follow her lead. Gone were the days of leisurely walks and endless parties. Now they were expected to learn the latest fashions and be the best at everything they did. Jane had a lot to learn, but she was up for the challenge. She wanted to please her new mistress and make a good impression on the king. In order to do so, she needed to perfect her manners, improve her French, and learn how to behave at court. Fortunately, she had plenty of time to practice, because now that Catherine was out of the picture, Anne had no rivals and Henry was completely devoted to her. There was no shortage of entertainment during this time, and Jane and her fellow ladies-in-waiting were expected to participate in everything. They played a variety of sports, including tennis, bowling, cards, dice, and tables. They also danced and sang, and they were expected to be witty and charming at all times. This was not a job for the faint of heart, but Jane was up to the task. She was intelligent, quick-witted, and beautiful, and she had the makings of a great lady-in-waiting. Over the next year, she and her fellow ladies-in-waiting would entertain the king and queen at parties, go on progress with them as they traveled around the country, and generally make life at court more enjoyable. They were also expected to be discreet and keep secrets for their mistress, which was not always easy. When Anne began to suspect that she was pregnant in late 1533, she confided in Jane and two other ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Knowles and Mary Parham. They were sworn to secrecy, but word got out anyway and the king was furious. He had her arrested on charges of adultery and treason, and she was executed on May 19, 1536. Jane witnessed the execution and was deeply affected by it. She had liked Anne and admired her strength and courage. Now she was dead and Jane was one of the suspects in the adultery charge. She knew she had to clear her name or she would be executed, too. Fortunately, Henry believed her story that she was innocent and he let her keep her head. However, he was still angry and he banished her from court, forbidding her from ever setting foot in his kingdom again. Jane left England immediately and returned to her family in Wales. She was devastated to leave everything she had worked so hard for behind, but she knew it was for the best. She could live a normal life now and maybe even find a husband. To watch part 3, click here. Thanks for watching. Previously on the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, we saw how the young and perhaps not so innocent Jane Seymour won the heart of the king away from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. We also learned how she gave birth to a dead son shortly after their marriage and then died herself in childbirth only months later, which was a massive disappointment to the king who desperately needed an heir. Now, before we move on to Henry's next wife, Anne of Cleves, let us linger for a moment on Jane Seymour and assess what kind of woman she really was. Hi everyone, welcome to this series, where I explore the lives of Henry VIII. Today we look at Jane Seymour. So when it comes to assessing Jane, there is little to go on. She is often portrayed as a scheming and manipulative woman who used her position as one of the ladies-in-waiting, Catherine of Aragon, to seduce the king and supplant the queen. However, if that were the case, Jane would have had to be cunning indeed, as it was in Bull or Not. Jane, who took these machinations to the highest level using her position as Lady Catherine to gain access to the king, thus becoming the center of a deadly game of courtly politics. In fact, we know that Jane was one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting when the queen fell out of favor with the king, and that she accompanied on 2 fronts after the queen's fall. So it seems unlikely that Jane was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Instead, the evidence points to Jane as being a bystander in the power struggles of the court, a pawn of the nobility who sought to use her as a tool to further their own interests. Let us examine her past to see how this might have been the case. Jane Seymour was born around 1509, the daughter of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth. Her father was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber to Henry VII and held the prestigious position of Master of the Horse. This made him an important member of the royal court and ensured Jane received an excellent education, something that would prove vital to her future. In 1526, Jane entered the service of the Queen, Catherine of Aragon, as one of her ladies-in-waiting. Her position depended on her father's favor with the king, and he in turn owed his place at court to his sister, Elizabeth Seymour, who was the Duchess of Norfolk and a powerful figure in her own right. So it seems that Jane's path in life was predetermined. Her family connections ensured her a place at court, but it was up to her to make the most of this opportunity. She did that brilliantly when the king's eyes turned from Catherine of Aragon to Anne. Like many others at court, Jane recognized the writing on the wall and did everything in her power to secure her future. Firstly, she made sure to stay on the right side of the king. And secondly, she got herself noticed. When Anne Boleyn became pregnant in 1532, she fell seriously ill, and it was Jane who nursed her back to health. As a reward for her diligence, Anne took Jane with her on her progress around England. It was during this trip that Jane caught the eye of the king. Perhaps he had seen her before, but it was on this occasion that he took notice. We know from the writings of the French ambassador that Henry remarked on her beauty and compared her to the famous mythological figure of Lear. Though he could not yet make his move on Jane, because Anne was still alive, he wasted no time in sending her a ring with the inscription "like Mitch," which, yes, is exactly what you think it means. In other words, she was his property and he could do with her as he pleased. The rest, as they say, is history. Henry Dumpton married Jane, and in the space of about 14 months, she gave him a dead son and then herself died in childbirth. But all this raises another question, namely why? Why did Henry dump Anne, who, despite her denials, was very likely innocent of the charges of adultery and treason leveled against her? To answer this, we must once again look beyond Jane Seymour and focus on the political machinations of the court. For Henry, the issue was no longer about love. He had had affairs before with women like Mary Boleyn and Elizabeth Blount, and he was certainly capable of having a roving eye. But now he wanted a son and heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to get one. This may sound harsh, and it is, but it is important to remember that Henry lived in a very different world to our own. For him, children were not primarily a blessing or a source of great joy, but a means of continuing his bloodline. And it was his responsibility as a man and a king to produce an heir. If he could not do this with Catherine of Aragon, then he would find someone else, and Jane Seymour was in the right place at the right time to become that someone. There were other factors at play here too, and not all of them concerned the future of the dynasty. Catherine of Aragon was nearing the end of her childbearing years. While she could still get pregnant, it was unlikely she would bear a living child. Jane, on the other hand, was in her 20s and at the peak of her fertility. Henry was attracted to her, yes, but so were the nobility who saw her as a way to advance their own positions. For example, the Duke of Norfolk was instrumental in pushing for the marriage between Jane and Henry. Not only was he the uncle of Jane, but he was also the father of one of Anne Boleyn's ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Blount, and he had good reason to want the marriage to take place. See, Henry had recently broken with the Catholic Church and was in the process of establishing himself as the supreme head of the Church of England. But he had gone about this in a rather haphazard manner and had alienated many of the powerful. To counter this, he needed allies, and the Duchy of Norfolk was one of the most powerful families in England. By marrying his daughter to the king, the Duke secured his family's future and enhanced his own status at court. Henry was also keen to marry Jane because of her family connections. Her father was one of the few survivors of the Battle of Flodden Field, which saw the deaths of Henry VII's elder brother, Prince Arthur, and a large number of English nobles. Henry had long desired to invade Scotland and annex the throne for himself by marrying into the Seymour family, who had close ties to Scotland. He hoped to secure potential allies against the Scots and end the long-standing Anglo-Scottish conflict. So it was not just Jane's beauty that attracted Henry, though that certainly helped. He wanted a new wife because he needed an heir. And with an out of the picture, Jane Seymour was the perfect candidate. It's hard to know what to make of Jane. On the one hand, she was a victim of circumstance, a pawn of the nobility, who used her as a means to their own ends. On the other, she actively courted the king and was willing to take advantage of Anne's fall. Which of these is the real Jane? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Henry VIII had 6 wives, but only one of them was executed. Find out who it was and why in my video on Anne Boleyn, which you can watch here. Thanks for watching. Part 4. Courtship and Conscience. Henry's heart may have been set on Jane, but before he could marry her, he had to win her hand in marriage. This took a bit longer than he expected. Jane was aware of how the public felt about her, and she knew that they were waiting with bated breath for her response to his proposal. She didn't want to appear too eager, so she played hard to get, and it worked. Henry, anxious for her reply, began to shower her with gifts, jewels, and finery, which only fueled rumors that the king had fallen head over heels for her. Meanwhile, Jane began visiting the sick and the poor in a show of piety and charity, hoping that these good deeds would help win over any remaining skeptics who thought her vain or so. But no matter how many people Jane helped, there were still those who saw her as nothing more than a gold digger, trying to trick the king into marriage so she could take his money and power for herself. In fact, one such rumor spread like wildfire after Henry gave her an astounding £3,000 at their first meeting. People whispered that it was a test to see if she would accept the bribe and agree to become his wife. It made matters worse when Queen Catherine of Aragon heard about the gift and assumed it was a wedding present. This caused a rift between her and Henry, who had to put out a statement denying Seymour was getting any money from him until after they were married. Throughout all of this, Jane was torn by her conscience. She loved Henry and couldn't wait to make him happy, but she worried that the public would never accept her as queen. Her friends and family tried to reassure her, telling her that she had nothing to be ashamed of and that once she became queen, everyone would forget about the rumors. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that easy. As the weeks passed and Henry still hadn't received an answer, his frustration grew. He wanted to marry Jane immediately, but she kept putting off the inevitable question. Then one day, while they were walking together in the gardens of Hampton Court Palace, he finally got the answer he'd been waiting for. Jane looked beautiful that day, radiant in a gown of deep red velvet, a color that symbolized both her courage and her love for him. They strolled through the gardens in silence, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the stone fountain. Suddenly, Henry stopped in his tracks and turned to face Jane. His eyes, usually twinkling with mischief, were now filled with a deep and serious expression. Taking a deep breath, he got down on one knee and reached out to her. "Jane," he said, his voice surprisingly husky with emotion, "I love you. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Jane's heart skipped a beat and tears welled up in her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, yet she could not believe it was actually happening. Surprised by his sudden proposal, she stammered, "Henry, I don't know what to say." She paused, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. Yes, I will marry you." The moment she uttered those words, a wave of relief and happiness washed over Henry. He quickly rose to his feet and pulled her into the tightest embrace. "Oh, Jane, I am the luckiest man in the world," he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much I love you." He held her at arm's length, his eyes shining with adoration. "You are my sun and my moon, my stars and my heart." From the moment Henry and Jane got engaged, the entire court was thrown into a frenzy of activity. There was a lot of work to be done before the wedding, invitations to send out, arrangements to make, and outfits to plan. Henry was eager to start the celebrations, but Jane was feeling a growing sense of dread. Despite being in love with Henry and excited to marry him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the accusing faces of the people of England, heard their whispers and doubts echoing in her ears. She tried to push the negative thoughts away, but they persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Jane began to question everything. Was she really ready for this? Was she doing the right thing by marrying the king? What if she wasn't accepted by the people? The doubts and fears threatened to consume her, turning her joy into despair. One evening, as Jane sat alone in her room, lost in her thoughts, a knock on the door startled her. When she turned around, she saw that it was just her lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth Sheldon, who had come to check on her. Elizabeth noticed a troubled look on Jane's face and asked, "My lady, what is troubling you? You have been distant and preoccupied lately. Is there anything I can help you with?" Jane hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to confide in her lady-in-waiting, but eventually decided to open up. "Elizabeth, she began, her voice shaky. I keep having these awful doubts and fears. I love Henry and I want to marry him, but I can't help but wonder if I'm making a mistake. Everyone expects me to be happy and excited, but all I feel is dread. I'm afraid of what people will say, of what they might do. I'm afraid I won't be able to live up to their expectations. Oh, Elizabeth, I just want to run away and hide. Elizabeth listened patiently, her eyes filled with understanding and compassion. When Jane finished speaking, she stepped closer and placed a comforting hand on her mistress's shoulder. My lady, she said softly, you are not alone in this. I know how much pressure you're under, how heavy the burden of expectations can be. But you must remember that you're not just doing this for yourself, but for Henry. He loves you and deserves your happiness. Don't let fear and doubt drive a wedge between you. Instead, focus on the love you share and the commitment you've made to each other. Trust me, milady, everything will work out for the best. Just believe in Henry and believe in yourself. Her words were like a balm to Jane's troubled soul. She felt a surge of determination and resolve. Yes, she was afraid, but she couldn't let her fear get the better of her. She owed it to Henry, to herself, and to their future together, to be strong and brave. Thank you, Elizabeth, she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. You're right. I can't let my fears ruin what Henry and I have. I have to trust him and trust myself. After all, we're in this together. As the wedding day approached, Jane's anxiety only grew. She found it difficult to sleep at night, her dreams filled with unsettling images and scenarios. During the day, she would pace her rooms restlessly, unable to focus on anything. Her appetite vanished and she lost weight. Everyone around her, from her ladies-in-waiting to her family members, were deeply concerned. They could see that Jane was struggling and tried their best to support her. One afternoon, as Jane sat by the window, staring listlessly into the distance, her sister Mary approached her. Jane, my dear sister, she said gently, you haven't touched the food you ordered. Are you even hungry? And why have you been moping around all day? You should be happy. We're only a few days away from the wedding, and I know how much you love Henry. Jane turned to her sister, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and desperation. Mary, I need your help, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't want to marry Henry. I do, but I'm terrified. I keep having these awful dreams, these premonitions, if you will. They tell me that something terrible will happen, that I'll bring nothing but misfortune to Henry. What if I'm not meant to be with him? Mary listened patiently to Jane's confession, her heart breaking at the sight of her sister in such distress. Once Jane finished speaking, she pulled her into a tight hug. Jane, my dear sister, you are not a bad omen. Your dreams are just that. Dreams. Don't let them control you. You are a strong, intelligent, and compassionate woman. Henry chose you because he loves you and knows you're perfect for him. Don't ever forget that. Mary's words gave Jane some comfort, but her fears were still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. As the wedding day drew near, the atmosphere in the kingdom grew tensed. People were divided over Jane's upcoming nuptials. Some saw it as a chance for a new beginning, while others believed it would bring nothing but sorrow and ruin. The constant chatter and speculation only added to Jane's anxiety, making it harder for her to keep her composure. Will Jane find the strength to go through with the wedding, or will she back out at the last minute? How will Henry react if she refuses to marry him? And what will become of the kingdom with Catherine of Aragon still in the picture? Find out next time on the channel. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more historical tales. Previously on the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, one of England's most eligible bachelors was beginning to feel the pressure to marry. His counselors wanted him to secure a Spanish bride in order to improve relations with the Catholic Church, but he had other ideas. Instead, Henry chose Jane Seymour, a young woman who had been at court for years, and was known to be sweet-tempered and obedient. They wed in secret and Jane soon became queen. But will she stay queen? Let's find out. Part 5. The political marriage. Henry's first marriage had been a disaster. He couldn't produce an heir with Catherine of Aragon, and she had also proved to be a stubborn pain in the royal backside. When it came to agreeing to a divorce, he had come to the throne knowing that there were many women in Europe who would have gladly become his wife. But once he had made that disastrous marriage, those options had dwindled. His advisors had pushed him toward a marriage with a Spanish princess, but that, too, had failed. So now the list of suitable candidates was looking pretty thin. On paper, Jane Seymour seemed like an excellent choice. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, so Henry already knew her and liked her. Her family wasn't overly powerful or wealthy, so they wouldn't threaten the king's authority. And best of all, she was young, beautiful, and very likely to bear him a son. But even though Henry was head over heels in love with Jane and their marriage was a happy one, he never married her for love alone. There was always something more, some calculation, some advantage he hoped to gain by choosing her. And this time it was simply practicality. Henry and Jane had met years before, and he had actually considered marrying her sister Mary. But by the time he had gotten around to asking Mary, she had become attached to one of Henry's courtiers, so he turned his attention to another Seymour sister. And even though Jane had once been promised to a member of the nobility, the Duke of Norfolk, that match fell through because, according to legend, the Duke didn't like sleeping with a woman who had been Queen Catherine's lady. Now, Henry was able to slip in and claim Jane for himself. even though the wedding ceremony was performed by a Dominican friar instead of a bishop and in secret, without telling anyone, not even his own counselors. In hindsight, it seems like such a strange thing to do. Why would two people who had been together for years and were madly in love want to hide their marriage? But Henry and Jane both had reasons for wanting to keep things a secret. For Henry, it was fear of the Pope. While he had successfully broken away from the Roman Catholic Church and founded the Church of England, he still needed to be recognized as the head of that church, and he knew that if he married Jane, the Pope would be very unhappy about it. The last thing he needed was for the Catholic world to turn against him. So he kept his marriage a secret until he could get the annulment from Catherine of Aragon through. As for Jane, well, we don't know why she wanted to keep the marriage a secret. It could have been because she was afraid of Catherine's wrath. Or maybe she was just as afraid of the scheming women at court as the next guy and didn't want them to know that she was now queen. Whatever her reason, she agreed to stay quiet, and the couple hid their marriage for months. And then Catherine found out. She received anonymous letters telling her what had happened, and she immediately began planning her revenge. She knew that Henry would eventually tire of Jane and come crawling back to her, so she waited patiently for him to make the first move. And make the first move he did. After Jane gave birth to a stillborn child and fell ill, Henry was beside himself with worry. He visited her constantly, and when she recovered, he went straight to work securing her position as queen. Catherine had been right. The birth of a child, whether dead or alive, was the most important thing for a queen, and if Jane couldn't produce a living, breathing prince, then she would never be secure in her position. So Henry married her in a grand ceremony and lavished her with gifts and honors. He built her a magnificent palace at Hampton Court and made her a royal mistress of the robes, a position created specifically for her. And then he gave her the one thing she wanted more than any jewel or gown, a child. While Jane was carrying their baby, he was beside himself with joy and anticipation. He visited her often, sometimes arriving in the middle of the night just to peek in and see how she was doing. When she went into labor, he paced the floor outside her room, wringing his hands. And when their son was born, he rushed to her side and cut the cord himself. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. A healthy, strong baby boy, and Jane was a good mother, too. She doted on their son, nursing him herself and spending hours rocking him in his cradle. The little prince was the apple of her eye, and she wanted nothing more than to keep him safe and happy. For the first time in Henry's life, he had a queen who was willing to put her husband and son above her own personal comfort. In fact, during Edward's christening, Jane allowed Henry to hold the child while she watched from across the room. She didn't try to take Edward away from him or fuss over him like other mothers. She just let him enjoy his moment and beamed with pride. But that didn't mean that everyone was happy for Jane. Many of the English nobles felt that Henry had made a mistake by marrying her. First of all, she was a woman of low birth. Sure, her father was a baronet, but that didn't count for much in the eyes of the nobility. They also thought that she was too meek and mild-mannered to be queen. And finally, they weren't sure if they could trust her. After all, she had been a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and who knows what secret she might be hiding. The worst part was that Jane knew this. She understood that she was the type of woman that these nobles would have chosen for their king. And she knew that they were just waiting for her to make a mistake so they could pounce. She tried her best to ignore them. She threw herself into her duties as queen, but it wasn't easy. Every time she went to a party or event, she felt their eyes on her back, wondering if she would fall flat on her face or say something stupid. And every time she did something wrong, no matter how small, they whispered about it. For weeks, everyone was talking about how Jane had curtsied to the wrong person at a royal reception. Imagine if the Queen of England curtsied to the wrong person, the Duchess of Norfolk. What would they have said if she had done that? Jane began to feel like she was drowning. She missed the days when she could walk through the castle halls without people staring at her. She missed being able to talk to her ladies-in-waiting without worrying that someone was watching. She even missed being a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. At least then she had friends. Here she was all alone. To make matters worse, Henry began to spend more and more time with one of his courtiers, a young woman named Anne. At first it had just been harmless fun, a way for Henry to break up the monotony of his life. But soon Anne was spending more nights at the palace than her own home, and Henry was beginning to neglect Jane in favor of her. Worst of all, he was paying attention to Anne while Jane was carrying their second child, a daughter. Jane didn't complain though. She didn't cry or beg for Henry's attention. She simply did her duty and bore his child. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, she died. As soon as Jane was dead, Henry was at Anne's side. He showered her with gifts and compliments and took her everywhere with him. Soon, everyone was whispering that Henry was going to marry Anne. And when Jane's daughter died shortly after her mother, they were proven right. After Jane's funeral, Henry announced that he was getting a divorce. Everyone knew that he was in love with Anne, and that he had been planning to get rid of Jane for months. Now, all he had to do was find a way to get rid of her without causing a scandal, and he thought he had the perfect solution. He would send her away to one of his castles, far from court, where she would live out the rest of her days in luxury. But Jane had other plans. When Henry told her of his decision, she didn't beg or plead. She simply told him to go ahead and get his divorce. Then she packed a single bag and disappeared. No one knows where she went. but rumors swirled that she had taken her own life. Others said that she had gone to France or Italy, where she lived out the remainder of her days under a false identity. But in reality, no one knows what happened to her, and if she is still alive, as some people believe, she lived a long and happy life. Unlike Jane, who was born a nobody and died, a Queen Anne Boleyn was destined to be remembered as one of the most infamous women in history, and you can learn all about her on the next episode of The Six Wives of Henry VIII. Special thanks to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. To learn how you can support the channel and appear on screen, to check the links below. Huge thanks to my editor Kelly and to my writer Sarah, and thanks to all of you for watching. Hello Anne Boleyn fans, it's me, and welcome back to this house where I bring you new videos every week exploring the dramatic, the tragic, and the sometimes funny events that took place here at the Tudor court. And in the sixth part of our series about Jane Seymour, we're going to look at how she became queen and what her brief time on the throne tells us about the Tudor ideal of feminine virtue. So if you're ready to get those brain cells milked, then let's get into it. Jane Seymour arrived at court just after Christmas in 1536, having been summoned by the king because he wanted to marry her. Henry was besotted with her, and the fact that she was a third cousin once removed didn't deter him in the slightest. He had his eye on her, and she was the one he wanted to be the mother of his much-desired son and heir. While Henry went through his annulment with Catherine of Aragon, Jane stayed at the household of the Duchess of Norfolk, living a quiet life until the divorce was complete and she could finally take her place as queen. But when it came, it was an astonishingly swift ceremony. On May Day morning, 1537, Jane was up before dawn, and by 7 a.m. she was dressed in a gown of cloth of gold, ready to be presented to the king. She was escorted down to the presence chamber where Henry was waiting for her, and there they exchanged rings, becoming man and wife. Then together they rode in procession from Greenwich Palace to Whitehall, where the coronation was to take place that afternoon. Jane rode in a golden chariot drawn by 8 horses, all wearing liveries of cloth of gold and carrying a white plume on their heads. The first lady in waiting behind her was the former Queen of Spain, Catherine of Aragon. This was a deliberate message from Henry that he was casting aside the past with his first wife and moving forward with his second. Once at Whitehall, the coronation ground, Jane changed into her robes and prepared to enter the church. Her skirt was made of red velvet, and over that she wore a gown of cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls and precious stones. On her head was a crown made of gold and adorned with 4 arches, also set with precious stones. Once it was on her head, it was fixed with a veil. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who had officiated at the annulment with Catherine, now placed a crown on Jane's head and proclaimed her queen. The choir then processed in and everyone sang a specially written anthem. After the ceremony, the new queen and her ladies returned to Whitehall, where she held a reception for the nobility. Later they all dined together in the Great Hall. Henry sat on a raised platform with Jane on his right-hand side, wearing a long flowing robe of red velvet. The king gave a rousing speech, declaring that he would rather be the meanest beggar than have any man so high as to be above him. Then they all danced. Henry danced with Jane, and afterwards, according to one chronicler, he seemed so joyful and light of heart that he was like a child at New Year's. After the festivities, they all retired to bedchambers where the newly married couple consummated their relationship. According to the same chronicler, the queen lay in a bed of red velvet with 4 posts, each decorated with banners displaying the royal arms. As you might expect, given that this is Tudor history we're talking about here, there were lots of children present during the wedding celebrations. Prince Edward, the young son of Henry and Catherine, attended with his mother. Princess Mary, his daughter by Catherine, was there too, along with the young French princess, Mary, who was being brought up in England as a potential bride for Edward. And so Jane's path to the throne had been a swift one, and her coronation was a very public affair, filled with symbolism that demonstrated the religious changes taking place in England as well as the power of the monarchy. Henry's break with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England had led to him being named supreme head of the church. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury, as the representative of the church in England, did not ask God to bless Jane, but simply declared her queen. Her clothing and jewelry symbolized the wealth and power of the crown, while the presence of Mary and the young Princess Mary sent a message to Europe that although Henry was forging new alliances, he was not turning his back on his children or their mothers. But how did Jane feel about all this? Well, the truth is we don't know. The problem with writing a history about women in the past is that they rarely left behind any personal writings that tell us their thoughts and feelings. Instead, we rely on the often biased accounts of male chroniclers. Jane is no exception. We know almost nothing about her personality or even how she felt about becoming queen, except for what we can glean from her actions. And some historians argue that we should view Jane through the lens of the Tudor ideal of feminine virtue. This ideal was a set of qualities expected of women in the Tudor era. They were expected to be subservient to men, both God and man, obedient, chaste, pure, and full of piety. Historian Susan James writes that Jane personified the Tudor ideal of feminine virtue, and that her role as passive collaborator with Henry was key to her success. In other words, to survive at court, You needed to play your feminine role properly, which included knowing how to please a man and make him happy. You needed to be seen and not heard, and you had to accept whatever position he put you in without complaint. When Henry first set eyes on Jane, she was a young woman of 24, relatively unknown outside of her family circle, having worked as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. She was described as demure, beautiful and sweet-tempered, and she was said to have a lovely singing voice. She was also a devout Catholic, which may have appealed to Henry, given that he wanted someone who would bear him a son more than someone who could challenge him intellectually. In fact, it was her supposed piety that led to her being chosen as a bride when Anne Boleyn failed to produce a son. Henry was looking for another wife, and Jane Seymour, with her demure nature, got the gig. So was Jane complicit in the downfall of Anne Boleyn? Did she actively work to supplant her friend and boss? Well, it's hard to say. Certainly it was widely reported that Jane had been having an affair with the king for some time, but there's little evidence to support this claim. It's possible that she was used by Henry to further his own agenda, that he spread rumors about her in order to make Anne look guilty. Whatever the truth, Anne was accused of adultery, imprisoned and then executed, and then Jane became the new queen. When she entered the role, she knew that she was in a precarious position. Queens in England were notoriously dangerous jobs, and she needed to ensure she was well liked by the king and the public in order to secure her position. To that end, she chose to dress plainly and modestly to show herself as a humble servant of the king and the church. She refused to wear expensive clothing and jewelry and instead opted for more simple garb. She supported the new religion wholeheartedly and was careful to avoid any scandal. In other words, she played the perfect Tudor woman. Historian Antonia Fraser argues that Jane probably didn't know how seriously the king took their relationship, saying that she may have hoped for a child, but assumed that he would return to Catherine once she had done her duty and produced an heir. Tragically, that's exactly what happened. By October 1537, Jane was pregnant and everyone at court buzzed with excitement. Could she really do what Catherine couldn't and bear the king a son? In late September, she went into labor, but the delivery went badly wrong. After struggling to give birth for 2 days, she suffered a postpartum infection and died on October 24th, only 12 days after giving birth to a stillborn son. She was buried in the Church of St. Mary's at Hampton Court, close to where she had died. Henry was devastated by her death, and many at court were genuinely sorry for her. Her gentle nature and pious ways had made her popular, and her untimely death was mourned throughout the kingdom. Was she a victim of the Tudor ideal of feminine virtue? Was she doomed to fail because she was expected to be so perfect? Historians debate whether or not she really was a passive player in her own story. What is certain is that she had few opportunities to make her own choices about her life. She may have been a good singer and enjoyed dancing, but those were seen as feminine accomplishments rather than signs of intelligence or wit. Her status as a private individual was swept aside when she was chosen by the king to be his wife, and her life was certainly in danger, as her predecessor Anne Boleyn had discovered. The speed of Henry's courtship and marriage to Jane is astonishing, and his determination to wed her demonstrates his obsession with producing a male heir. Given that Jane died after only 12 days as queen, it seems unlikely that she was anything other than a pawn in Henry's game. Had she lived longer, might she have asserted herself more strongly? Might she have become the powerful queen consort that Elizabeth I eventually became? Or was her fate sealed by the Tudor ideal of feminine virtue, which demanded that she'll be seen and not heard? You decide. Let me know what you think about Jane in the comments below. And if you'd like to learn more about her, why not try one of these options? I have a whole playlist on Jane Seymour, including videos about her childhood and her rise to power. I've also done videos about her predecessors, including Mary and Anne. Next week, I'm going to be looking at the funeral of Lady Rochford, one of Anne Boleyn's ladies-in-waiting, who was accused of adultery and later executed. So join me then to find out what happened to her. If you run a performance venue in the UK and would like to book a live show, please get in touch. And finally, a huge thank you to my supporters who help to keep the channel running. If you'd like to support the channel, please become a patron. I'll be back next week with a brand new video. Until then, keep learning. Part 7, A House in Order. Jane Seymour had finally reached the top of the royal heap. After a whirlwind romance and hasty marriage, she was now the wife of Henry VIII and the stepmother of his children. The future, Queen Elizabeth I, and the recently disgraced Mary Tudor, the young queen, was understandably apprehensive about her new role and how she might handle it. But fortunately, Jane was not alone. She had her lady-in-waiting, the gentle and ever-faithful Elizabeth Shell, as well as her own mother and brother, who had come from their modest home in Wiltshire to help her adjust her life at court. As she settled into her new position, one of Jane's first considerations was the state of the court. Though there had been many changes during Henry's reign, it was still far from the ideal setting for a proper queen consort. The king was notorious for his rages and fits of depression, and while his 6 weddings were scandalous but not unheard of, 2 of them taking place within the space of 3 months had been unprecedented. The royal family was also divided. Mary Tudor had been stripped of her title as heir to the throne and sent away from court. Princess Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate and sent to live with her aunt, the Duchess of Norfolk. and Henry's younger siblings, the recently married princesses Mary and Elizabeth, along with their mother, the former Queen of Spain, were currently in exile in France. There were few allies in England who had been caught up in the maelstrom of the king's failed marriages and were willing to speak out against him. The country was in turmoil. Scotland had broken away from the Church of England. The French alliance was falling apart. The long-term alliance with Spain was also fraying, and the threat of invasion by the Holy Roman Emperor's forces loomed over the horizon. This was not a kingdom that was ready for a new queen. But Jane Seymour was up for the task. Despite being young, she was level-headed and possessed a quiet confidence that belied her years. She understood her strengths and played to them, presenting herself as pious and docile, obedient and demure, while exercising a shrewd and quiet influence over her husband. She knew that to succeed where others had failed, she would have to win over the English people, something Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn had failed to do. To this end, Jane began by making small but significant changes around the royal court. Gone were the Italian and French fashions that Catherine and Anne had favored. In their place were modest English garments made from fine woolens and linens, though sometimes featuring fashionable French cuts. Out went the foreign servants who had filled key positions in the previous households, and in came English courtiers, who owed their jobs to Jane as mother and brother. One by one, the Seymours took over key positions of power, becoming trusted advisors and confidants to the king. While some courtiers saw Jane's influence as a positive development, especially as she seemed content to let Henry have his way most of the time, others chafed under the influx of provincial relatives and the return to old-fashioned courtliness. Even Henry's close friend, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, was sidelined. As for Jane's old flame, the dashing courtier Guilford Feckenham, he returned to the king's favor after a fashion, but only because Henry found him useful as a spy. When the king suspected his wife of infidelity, as he often did, it was Feckenham that Henry sent to spy on her, no doubt to his lady's amusement. Jane Seymour was also keen to restore order to the royal household. Unlike her predecessors, who had found themselves at the center of political storms, she wanted to step back and let Henry take the lead. While they were suited to each other in some ways, they were also very different. Jane was pious and gentle, serious and demure, while Henry was given to bouts of depression and rage, prone to immaturity and petulance. Despite his regal bearing and formidable presence, it was not an unusual pairing. Their union would produce a son and heir which had eluded Henry for nearly 2 decades, and a peace that he had never known in his marriages. Though this was more due to the restraint Jane brought to their relationship than any great affection between them. Their first Christmas together was a turning point in the young queen's life. No longer was she the girl who had risen from obscurity to become queen by way of the king's infatuation. Now she was a mature woman who ran the household and bore her husband's child. While some courtiers complained of the influx of Jane's relatives into the royal court, the king was delighted by the spectacle of children running through the palace, chasing a dog that the Seymour family brought with them. For once, he forgot his troubles and joined in their games. This brief moment of carefree happiness, along with the fact that Jane was pregnant, led him to write a touching love poem to her, which he set to music and performed for her. His heart may have belonged to Anne Boleyn, but in Jane Seymour, Henry found a partner who could make a good match for him, both politically and personally. Despite her wish to keep her distance from the political maelstrom, Jane Seymour could not help but get drawn into it when the aging and increasingly senile King Edward VI fell ill. For Henry, this presented an opportunity to end a long-standing alliance with the House of Tudor by marrying Mary Tudor to the young king. This would have restored the old balance of power in Europe and avenged the humiliation he had suffered at the hands of her family. Not surprisingly, Jane opposed the idea, which came as something of a shock to the court, as she had never before been known to voice her opinion so boldly. But she won the day, and Mary stayed out of the line of succession, at least for the moment. The birth of a son created its own problems. However, Prince Henry was born in September of 1534, but he lived only 2 months. Many believe that Jane, who was known to have miscarried before his birth, had poisoned the infant prince in order to regain favor with her husband, who was inconsolable at the loss of a son and heir. Whether or not there was any truth to these rumors, Jane bore her husband's grief-stricken rages without complaint, patiently waiting for another chance to secure her position. In January of 1536, while Henry was on a hunting trip in Norfolk, Jane finally gave birth again, this time to a daughter named Elizabeth. Once again, the entire court waited anxiously for the king's reaction. Would he accept the child who threatened to push his elder daughter out of the line of succession? Just as Mary Tudor had been removed, he did not. Overjoyed at the birth of a legitimate heir, Henry showered Jane with gifts and had her lavishly rewarded. For her pains, her ladies-in-waiting were given sumptuous new outfits, and her mother and brother received further advancement in the royal court. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Shelton, who had been Jane's rock throughout, was rewarded with the position of governess to the newly christened Princess Elizabeth. Now that Henry was happy with his youngest daughter's arrival, it was time to address the issue of Mary. Jane supported her half-sister-in-law's claim to the throne, possibly hoping that this would put to rest the rumors that she had plotted to kill the young Prince Henry. But it was probably more because she recognized that Mary, despite having been out of favor for nearly 2 decades, was still widely beloved in England, and that her removal from the line of succession was creating unrest. Mary was called back to court and allowed to stay at court, though she was forbidden to marry. Jane even visited her half-sister-in-law in person to offer her support and comfort. With the major family divisions overcome, Jane turned her attention to foreign affairs. She was particularly concerned about the ongoing conflict in Scotland and the increasing threat posed by the Holy Roman Emperor. Along with her brother, she urged the king to come to terms with the Scottish nobility, arguing that war would hurt England more than it would help. This time, Jane's pleas fell on deaf ears. Henry was determined to impose Protestantism on the Scots, and he sent his forces to invade. But after several battles with little results, he was forced to return to England and sign a treaty with Scotland. Once again, Jane's influence was felt as she pushed her husband to find peaceful solutions to his problems. As always, the path to peace ran through religion. In 1539, she helped to draft the 6 Articles, also known as the Queen's Articles, which aimed to end the religious disputes that had been tearing England apart. Unfortunately for Jane, the Articles did not bring about the desired peace, and the king soon grew tired of her opposition to his religious reforms. In a fit of pique, he banished her from court and accused her of treason, all because she had dared to question his authority. While Jane may have been able to endure Henry's anger in the early days of their marriage, she was much changed by then. Now she had seen what a monster the man she loved was capable of and how easily he could turn on her. Like those before her, she learned that there was no place for a queen in the court of King Henry VIII. For more on Jane Seymour, see my video, Who Was Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, or watch any of these other videos. Part 8, Maternal Triumph. Jane Seymour was showing. Everyone was aware that the time was approaching when the nation would learn whether their new king would have a son or a daughter. In fact, a son was expected. The king's advisors were already making plans for a male heir, unaware that Jane was carrying a daughter. The royal court followed the progress of the pregnancy with bated breath, hoping against hope that the long-awaited male heir would finally be born. But as the time approached, the king's health took a turn for the worse. He had an agonizingly slow decline, suffering from leg ulcers and other health issues. Yet he still managed to attend Jane Seymour's delivery in person. How very romantic now. Henry was present at Hampton Court Palace when Jane went into labor. He watched anxiously while his wife gave birth to their child. This was a crucial moment, not just for Jane and Henry, but for the entire Tudor dynasty. After 6 long and difficult pregnancies, Henry had finally managed to produce a legitimate male heir. A princess would have been a disappointment. It wasn't that Henry didn't love his daughters, but he desperately needed a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. After 6 weeks of pregnancy, it was clear that Jane would not miscarry this time. And despite being visibly ill, the king did not leave her side, staying with her day and night. Henry's counselors realized that if the baby was indeed a boy, then Jane might become the most powerful woman in England. His counselors urged him to return to his health and to bed rest instead of staying by Jane's side, but he refused. On October 12, 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She was elated, but also knew that she might die. She had pushed herself to the limit during the difficult labor, and now her body was weak. Henry was beside himself with joy. He rushed to Jane's side, eager to see his son. When he first saw his son, he was so overcome with emotion that he burst into tears. Henry held his newborn son close, overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude and relief. Finally, after years of trying, they had a son. The little prince's cries filled the room, echoing Henry's own joy. However, Jane never got to see the son she had carried for 9 months. As soon as the baby was born, he was taken away to be presented to the king and the queen's nurse. Jane was too weak to care for him, and so it was decided that someone else would do it for her. As soon as the king learned that his son was a true blue Englishman, he ordered that a gun salute be fired to announce the happy news. But poor Jane never got to hear the celebratory gunfire because she was fast asleep from a sleeping draught, which was given to her to help her through the night. When she awoke, she asked to see her son, but she was told that he was being cared for by the queen's nurse. Still weak and unaware of what was happening, Jane did not insist. She was too exhausted and in too much pain to care. All she wanted was to rest. But while she slept, the king summoned all of his counselors and lords to come and see the baby. They all came flocking, eager to catch a glimpse of the future king. Jane Seymour died on October 24, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to her son, Edward. Her death was caused by complications from the C-section birth and the use of a device used to control bleeding after childbirth. But it was not without its risks. The pessary had probably perforated the wall of the womb, causing infection and internal bleeding. This would have been a slow and agonizing death for young Jane, who was only 26 years old. When she died, the king was furious. He was angry that she had not lived longer, so that she could see their son grow up. But he was also angry at her for dying when she had fulfilled her duty and given him a son. What more could he have asked for? Henry VIII was determined to find a new wife as soon as possible. He needed someone to bear more children, preferably sons. But he also wanted someone who was young enough to have children for many years to come. The perfect candidate was a young woman named Anne of Cleves, who was only 25 years old. Henry was infatuated with her from the moment he met her, and he wasted no time in marrying her. Within weeks, the wedding bells were ringing and Anne became the new queen. But Henriette's obsession with youth and beauty blinded him to the fact that Anne was not the right choice. She was headstrong and independent, and she soon became a thorn in Henry's side. He grew to hate her and he began to look for a new wife once again. And who could blame him? After all, he was the king. And besides, he had plenty of money to go around. So if he didn't like one of his wives, he could just get rid of her and marry someone else. It was just that simple. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified when a new video is released. This is part 9 of our series, The Disastrous Downfall of Jane Seymour. We're nearing the end. And for those who have been here from the beginning, thank you so much. If you've just joined us, welcome to the series. You can find the rest of the episodes in the playlist provided. In this episode, we will be looking at how Jane Seymour died, the events surrounding it, and how her death affected both Henry and England. This is a tragic part of their story and one that should not be glossed over. We'll be discussing what really happened with the post-mortem and why some historians believe it was done incorrectly. As a reminder, this series is not intended to be a judgmental retelling of events, but rather an exploration into the past to learn what we can about the lives of these historical figures. If you enjoy learning about the past, especially during this time period, then please subscribe to stay updated on when new videos come out. Let's begin. On October 1537, while still staying at Hampton Court Palace, Jane Seymour experienced some kind of problem with her health. We don't know exactly what happened or why, but she began hemorrhaging badly. Her lady-in-waiting would later say that Jane had passed out after giving birth to the prince, having a fever and bleeding heavily. But according to the official account written by her doctors, Jane became ill after being out in the cold. It read, "The queen being at supper fell sick and was taken with a shivering fit. She had also great bleeding at the nose and gums, and shortly after, being in a privy chamber, she swooned away." Although this may seem like an obvious attempt to cover up the truth of what happened, it is likely that they were trying to protect Jane's reputation, as the doctors knew that blaming her for the miscarriage would only cause trouble for themselves. At this point, no one realized how serious her condition was, including Jane herself. So she was simply told to rest, eat nourishing foods and drink plenty of wine, which apparently she did until the morning of October. It was then that she started to get worse. As soon as the sun came up, she summoned her ladies-in-waiting and told them to pray beside her bed, for she believed she was going to die. She seemed to realize that something was seriously wrong and she didn't have long left. Before she died, she gave instructions for her funeral, telling them to use all of her jewels and fine clothes to make a coffin as beautiful as possible. In fact, she wanted it to be made of red cloth and covered with white satin. She also asked that all of the hangings in her rooms be taken down and used to make winding sheets. One of her ladies-in-waiting later reported that Jane was distressed about dying and leaving the baby without a mother. When she heard the child crying, she told her ladies that she wished she could have died before he was born, because now he would grow up without her and she would never see him again. After hearing this, one of the ladies began to cry, which upset Jane. She told her to stop and instead pray. Unfortunately, her request for her ladies not to cry at her funeral wouldn't be respected, and neither would her wish to not have a public funeral. She would become the first Queen of England to have a public funeral since the time of Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who died in 1561. More on her later. But back to Jane's final moments. At around 9 a.m., her breathing began to become more shallow and her pulse very weak. The princess, Lady Margaret Pole, who would become Lady Jane Grey after her cousin, Princess Elizabeth, was deposed, was summoned to see Jane, who at this point was unconscious. She would later report seeing Jane open her eyes slightly. The princess prayed with her and sang a psalm while holding Jane's hand. After this, she left to go and check on the baby, and upon returning, found that Jane was dead. The exact time of her death isn't known, but it was sometime between 9 and 10 in the morning. Her doctors were present at her death, and after confirming she was dead, they dressed her body, placed it in a coffin and sent it off to Windsor Castle to await the arrival of the king. When Henry heard the news, he immediately set out to see his wife, arriving at Windsor at around 4 in the afternoon. He stayed the night there before returning to London the next day. During their short time together, he visited the room where Jane had died and angrily ordered that the place be kept exactly as it was. On the following Monday, he allowed the public to come and view their dead monarch. They lined the streets as the procession went through, and many came down with fevers after being exposed to the rotting corpse. Jane's burial took place 3 days later. On October, she was initially laid to rest in the Church of St. George at Windsor Castle, but would later be moved to a more permanent tomb in the nearby chapel of St. Mary of the Angels. Her funeral was a lavish affair, even by the standards of the Tudor royal family. According to one chronicler, She was buried in a magnificent manner. Cloth of gold and velvet was used to line her coffin, and 4 white horses were used to pull her to her grave. These horses had red girths, saddles, and bridles, and were accompanied by 4 black horses wearing similar equipment. The procession was headed by her doctors and included many members of the nobility. After her burial, Henry remained obsessed with the idea that Jane was cursed and caused him nothing but grief. For example, her statue, along with those of her mother and grandmother, were removed from the South Choir aisle in Canterbury Cathedral in 1559 for fear of what might happen if they were taken down. While Henry's obsession with the curse of the Seymour family is probably an exaggeration, there is no denying that they suffered a lot of tragedy. Of Jane's 5 siblings, only to live to beyond childhood, and died in her teens, and Mary Sakuna Scots met the execution. The family home was also destroyed by fire, killing her father, brother, and sister, as well as several nieces and nephews. But perhaps the most devastating blow to the family came from their only surviving member, Edward Seymour, 1st Earl of Hertford. He conspired against his own brother, the Duke of Somerset, and was executed for treason in 1552. While Henry was devastated by Jane's death, he was not above making light of the situation in order to paint himself in a better light. Shortly after she died, he had a song written about it and performed at Christmas that year. It goes like this: "Like my boots, the merry men all come, Christmas is come, and Christmas is gone. Alas, poor Jane, she is dead, she never shall come again." The French were never so merry as when our good Queen Jane was in her grave. God damn the day, God damn the hour. When she died, our hearts did break in too. Jane's death left a huge hole in Henry's heart, but it also left a hole in the succession. Their son had been born prematurely and was unlikely to survive. The possibility that he would die meant that Henry needed another wife who could produce healthy children. Since Jane's sisters had proven to be good options, it's likely that he would have married Jane's younger sister, Mary, had she not been in exile. Instead, he was forced to look elsewhere and eventually married Catherine Parr, who bore him a daughter and outlived him. Over the years, rumors have persisted that Jane was actually pregnant at the time of her death with another girl, and that her doctors killed her to cover up their mistake. This rumor has no basis in fact and appears to have started with a scandalous broadside printed shortly after her death, titled "The Whole Truth of the Lady Jane Seymour's Death." Although the author of the pamphlet is unknown, many have assumed it was written by one of Jane's ladies-in-waiting who witnessed her death and claimed that she was pregnant. However, this is not true. There is no evidence that she was ever pregnant again or that her doctors killed her. It is possible that people wanted to believe the rumor because it would mean that Jane was the one who died instead of the other way around. But it's equally possible that it was just a malicious lie. If you want to watch our series in order, click the playlist provided. Thank you to all of our supporters for helping us continue to bring these videos to life. If you would like to support us, please consider becoming a member. The links are in the description below. Don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe for new videos. I'll see you next time. Part 10: A King's Grief. Henry VIII's reaction to Jane Seymour's death was a mixture of grief, guilt, and fear. He adored her and their son, the future Edward VI, and he blamed himself for both their deaths. But most of all, he was terrified of what people would think about him if he showed any emotion. What would this say about his masculinity? Would it make him appear weak or indecisive? So instead, he did what kings had been doing for centuries. He built a monument to his beloved, one that would outlive any slanderous rumors. But why did he insist she'll be buried beside him at Windsor? And why is she the only wife to receive this honor? Let's find out. Jane Seymour died on October 1537 after giving birth to a son, the future Edward VI. She was buried in the Church of St. George at Windsor Castle, close to where Henry's other wives had been laid to rest. But when Henry decided to have a monument erected to commemorate her, he chose a spot right in the middle of the choir, smack in the middle of the floor. This would have been a huge deal back then. The royals didn't mingle with commoners, even in death, and no one, not even the Queen, was buried in the main part of the church, unless they were the monarch. And he wasn't done. His next instruction was to remove Jane's remains from their temporary resting place and re-enter them right under the monument. Well, technically he didn't order the exhumation per se. He sent an ominous letter to the prior of the Augustinian monastery, where she was temporarily buried, instructing him to do something about the state of the body, because he wanted to move it as soon as possible. Translation: dig her up before she starts to stink. It was a cold October, so there wasn't much time to lose. The entire affair must have been awful for the poor monks who dug up Jane's body. They had only given her a full burial 2 months prior. In fact, they had decorated her coffin with escutcheons bearing the royal arms of England and France, along with a beautiful canopy. No doubt they were quite proud of their handiwork, only to have it defiled moments later when they pried open the coffin and hauled her out. Talk about adding insult to injury. It's likely that by this point her body was already in advanced stages of decay, which would have been off-putting even to someone like Henry, who had seen his fair share of dead bodies. Imagine being paid to bury someone only to have your job undone 2 months later. You would be pretty peeved, too. But these monks had no choice. They were simply following orders. After the exhumation, Jane's remains were placed in a vault beneath the monument that Henry had commissioned. Why did he insist on burying her here? Because he wanted everyone to know just how devastated he was over her death. This might seem cruel, having her body disinterred and displayed for all to see, but it was actually a sign of respect and affection. Back in Tudor times, it was customary for wealthy families to display the remains of their loved ones in the family chapel, almost like a shrine. Sometimes they would even dress up the bones, placing them in elaborate clothing and jewelry. I don't think Henry had this in mind for Jane, but he did want to put her remains somewhere prominent. That way everyone would know just how much he cared for her. Another reason is that he knew people would question Jane's burial site. After all, she was only the third of his 6 wives. Catherine of Aragon was still alive, albeit in disgrace, and then Boleyn and Catherine Howard were dead, and still very much hated by the public. If Henry didn't do something to honor Jane, people would assume he didn't really love her and that he only married her to produce a male heir. By building a lavish tomb and allowing her to be buried in the choir at Windsor, he was saying, "I loved her, and I will show the world." And what better way to show his love than to join her in death as well? Only one other person had ever been allowed to be buried in the choir at Windsor, Henry's father, Henry VII. It was quite a coveted burial site, reserved only for royalty. By choosing to be buried beside Jane, Henry was elevating her status, letting everyone know that she was more than just another one of his wives. She was the only one he truly loved, at least that's what he wanted everyone to think. As for Jane, she got the royal treatment in death that she never received in life. The funeral procession traveled from Hampton Court Palace to Windsor, accompanied by a massive crowd. The body lay in state for 3 days, with crowds gathering outside the church to catch a glimpse of the coffin. When it was finally lowered into the vault, it was surrounded by 6 of Jane's ladies-in-waiting who died with her. What a touching sound. How fitting that she should be entombed with those who cared for her so deeply. These 7 women were interred around the base of the monument, ensuring that Jane was never truly alone. Now, let's get back to Henry. When he began planning his own funeral, he made sure to include Jane, even though they had been dead for 24 years. He ordered that his coffin be placed beside hers and that the sides of both coffins be removed so that their remains could mingle, showing that despite the passage of time, his love for her had not faded. But he took it a step further by including a portrait of her on his tomb, along with one of their son, Edward. Why did he choose Jane for this honor and not one of his other wives? We can only speculate, but it's likely that he wanted to send a message to the world about how much he regretted his decision to break away from the Catholic Church. Jane was the only one of his wives who died a virgin, and her death was seen as a kind of martyrdom. By including her portrait on his tomb, Henry was making a statement. He may have been the one who broke with Rome, but it was Jane who paid the ultimate price. In death, he was sending a message of repentance, showing that he knew he had made a terrible mistake. The monument itself is a masterpiece of Renaissance sculpture, designed by John Michael and Pietro Torrigiani. It's made of white marble and stands over 16 feet tall, making it one of the largest tombs in Windsor Castle. The effigies of Henry and Jane are carved in such a lifelike manner that it seems as if they are simply sleeping. Their faces are serene, their bodies relaxed. It's as if they are unaware of the pain they endured in life. The tomb also includes the figures of 2 little boys representing Henry and Jane's children, as well as taputi, or little angels. One holds a shield emblazoned with the royal arms of England and France, while the other holds a flower. The symbolism is clear. Henry and Jane are protected by the power of the crown, and their love is eternal. No one knows exactly what Henry was thinking when he commissioned this tomb, but it's clear that he wanted to be buried beside Jane for all eternity. He wanted the world to know that despite the pain and suffering they had endured together, their love had triumphed in death. He died in January of 1547, knowing that he would soon be reunited with his beloved. He was carried to the tomb on a golden bier, surrounded by a massive crowd. The coffin was covered with black velvet and adorned with the royal crest. As it was lowered into the vault, a choir of angels sang, "Now I lay me down to sleep," a song that would become a lullaby for generations to come. And so Henry and Jane's remains were finally laid to rest together, their bodies mingling as one. They had chosen each other in life, and now they were choosing each other in death. What do you think? Was Henry a good husband? Do you think Jane was happy with him? Or was she merely a pawn in Henry's game of royal intrigue? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for more videos about Henry VIII and his wives. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so you never miss an episode. Until next time, bye. This is part 11 of our series on the life of Jane Seymour. If you missed any of the previous episodes, you can find them in the playlist linked above or below. This is the story of Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife of Henry VIII, and the mother of the Tudor dynasty. As we discussed in part 10, following the birth of Prince Edward, Jane's health took a turn for the worse, and she sadly died just 12 days later. As the midwives were in attendance at her death, they noted that she had suffered from a fever and convulsions, which fits with what we know about postpartum complications. However, others have speculated that Jane was likely poisoned by one of the many people who stood to benefit from her demise, including Queen Dowager Elizabeth of York, Henry's fourth potential bride, Catherine Parr, and even Henry himself. For more on these theories, check out our episode on Jane's death, also available in the playlist. In this episode, we are going to look at the events following Jane's death and how her young son ascended to the throne and lived up to his mother's legacy as the woman who finally gave Henry a much-needed male heir. It's time to look at Part 11, Edward VI. The son Jane left behind. Henry was inconsolable after losing both Jane and their newborn son. He cancelled all official business for 2 days, refusing to see anyone, not even his counselors. At Jane's funeral, he behaved erratically, throwing himself onto her coffin and shouting, "My Jane, my loving Jane," before collapsing in grief. Although he did marry again, a little over a year later, choosing Catherine Parr, his fourth and final wife, he never stopped mourning Jane, even requesting that she'll be moved from her original grave to a more prominent tomb in Windsor Castle, where he would visit her often. Even after Jane's death, Henry continued to blame her brother George for mismanaging her illness. Following her death, he pulled him from his position as controller of the household and charged him with murdering Jane. While George did appeal his sentence and was eventually reinstated in his position, he was never truly forgiven by Henry. While Henry mourned the loss of Jane, little Edward was cared for by a group of women known as the Six Gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, who were tasked with finding suitable wet nurses for the child. After selecting two, one from the home of the Duke of Norfolk and another from the home of the Bishop of Winchester, the infant Edward was sent to live with his father's sister, Mary, Countess of Salisbury. Initially, this arrangement went well, but after Mary fell ill, Edward was sent back to court and placed under the care of his uncle, the Duke of Somerset. Somerset doted on the boy and reportedly loved playing with him, while Edward adored his uncle in return. However, like so many other men in Henry's inner circle, Somerset became a victim of the king's paranoia and was accused of treason, largely on the basis of false evidence. Just days after Edward's first birthday, Somerset was executed, and Edward, who had been staying with his uncle at the time, had to be quickly whisked away from the premises to avoid any association with the traitor. From there, he was taken to live with his the Dowager Queen Elizabeth of York, who was given the title of governess to the young prince. After living in relative peace for several years, Edward's life was once again thrown into chaos when his father Catherine Parr was an intelligent and pious woman who was initially well-liked by the public. But since she was older than Henry and didn't give him any children, she quickly became a target for those hoping to advance their own power, including the young Edward. According to one story, when the now 9-year-old Edward visited his father shortly after Catherine's arrival, Henry was so overcome with paternal affection that he picked him up and started to dance around the room. Catherine watched this interaction with amusement until Henry set the boy down and asked Catherine to join him in a dance. She refused, saying that she lacked the ability and wasn't dressed appropriately for dancing. Angered by her refusal, Henry angrily set her down and stormed off, declaring that no one dared to disobey him. However, the story goes that later that evening, after Catherine had retired, Henry came to her chambers and begged her to forgive him for his earlier outburst, and the couple danced together late into the night. This story, however, may be apocryphal and intended to make Catherine look bad. Following this incident, Catherine began to plan a new education for Edward, wanting him to grow up to be a godly and learned man. She hired several tutors for him, one of whom was famed Protestant scholar and future Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. However, Henry was not happy with Catherine's influence over his son and removed her from the role of governess, giving it instead to the Duchess of Norfolk. Regardless, Catherine remained close to the royal family and Edward in particular. She ensured that Edward attended church services with her and Mary, his half-sister, where he impressed onlookers with his piety. On one such occasion, he even preached a sermon to the entire court. However, Henry was less impressed by his son's religious zeal and wanted him to enjoy a more carefree childhood. Unfortunately, Edward was shy and struggled to make friends outside of the royal family. We know that he had some cousins his own age, but he spent most of his time alone, reading books and praying. Tragedy struck once again in July of 1536 when Henry VIII died, leaving the throne to his 17-year-old son, Edward VI. Although Henry had named him heir long before Jane's death, many believed that Lady Jane Grey, daughter of Henry's deceased sister Mary, would be next in line. Lady Jane was a Protestant and many hoped that she would lead England away from her increasingly Catholic practices. However, Edward was a devout Protestant himself, and he had been tutored by some of the leading Protestant scholars in England. His coronation gown was embroidered with the words, "The 6 Articles of the Catholic Faith," and he chose the traditional coronation oath. After being crowned king, he wasted no time in announcing his commitment to the Protestant faith, famously stating, "I will set my hand to no article which tends not to the extirpation of error and the propagation of pure and undefiled truth." Under Edward's rule, England would become a Protestant nation. Thomas Cranmer, who had tutored Edward alongside other Protestant reformers, would eventually become Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Book of Common Prayer, written by Thomas Cromwell, would become the standard prayer book for the Church of England. Edward's dedication to the Protestant faith did not endear him to everyone. Catherine Parr, who had married Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane, was accused of plotting with the Seymour family and Lady Jane Grey to overthrow the young king and replace him with Jane Grey. Although Catherine and the Seymour siblings were indeed plotting, it was against Edward's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who they viewed as a threat to the stability of the government. There is little evidence that Edward was ever in danger during this plot. However, Catherine was beheaded on charges of treason, while Thomas Seymour was executed for high treason after attempting to kidnap Edward in order to force the young king to declare his sister, Mary, illegitimate, and name Jane Grey heir to the throne. These events deeply affected Edward, who never married and instead dedicated his life to the church. Unfortunately, Edward's dedication to his new religion was cut short when he fell ill. After suffering for months, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis and died at the age of 15. Just 6 years after taking the throne, he was buried next to his mother in Windsor Castle, fulfilling Jane's lifelong wish to have her son near her. When Jane Seymour entered the picture, Henry VIII was desperate for a male heir. With his marriage to Anne Boleyn, he was willing to break away from the Catholic Church to secure a divorce and marry Jane. With her, he finally had the son he so desperately wanted and needed. However, that son would only live for 15 years. Tragically, the boy who had been born to save the Tudor dynasty ultimately failed to do so. Mary, his half-sister, would go on to become queen, but she would face a number of challenges during her reign. Her half-brother, Henry VIII, would also attempt to claim the throne, but he too would fail. It would be left to Elizabeth, Henry's only legitimate daughter, to restore stability to the country and ultimately save the Tudor dynasty. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already and leave us a comment to let us know what you think happened to Edward VI. Special thanks to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to my channel, part 12 of my series on Jane Seymour. In this episode, we were going to look at how Jane was remembered in Tudor memory, looks at how Jane was remembered in chronicles, portraits, and popular legend during and after Henry's reign. As always, if you would like to find out more about the sources used in these videos, please do check out the bibliography in the description box below. If you enjoy these videos, please be sure to subscribe and leave a like because it helps me a lot. Thank you so much to all of my supporters for supporting this channel. Your support means more than you know. In my last video, we looked at the differing accounts of Jane's death, and while her end was rather unceremonious, by the end of Henry's reign, she was already being elevated to martyrdom and was seen as having suffered for her conscience. This image of Jane as a victim of circumstance had taken hold in the minds of some, as well as the idea that Henry had only married her because he wanted another son. The first mention of Jane in print after Henry's death came in a pamphlet written by an aunt. It was called The Order of the Garter and appeared in 1550. Jane is spoken of with great reverence. As you can see here, her portrait is included alongside other female martyrs such as Elizabeth I. Mary Tudor and Lady Jane Grey, further cementing her place in the martyr class, although her inclusion here is somewhat confusing given that Elizabeth and Mary were alive at this point. The text accompanying her portrait reads as follows. This is the picture of the Lady Jane Seymour, King Edward VI's sister and lawful wife of King Henry VIII, who was the third of his wives and died in childbed, leaving no issue. The fourth wife of the said king was Anne of Cleves, whose picture followeth. She was the lady whom the king divorced upon the like as that he did his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whom he kept 6 years and 8 months. So, pretty scathing of Anne of Cleves there. The next printed source mentioning Jane is a broadside ballad which dates to around 1554. It is called The Lamentation of the Lady Jane Seymour, and it tells the story of Jane's unhappy marriage to Henry and her untimely demise. Again, the idea of Jane as a victim is very apparent here in the piece paints a very sympathetic picture of the third queen. I will link the full text of the ballad below if you want to have a read, but here are a couple of stanzas to give you an idea of its contents. How pale may a lady be that hath no cause to blush? Her cheeks as wan and pale as though she were in hell. She weeps alone withouten any company, and that right sore. She was sometime the fairest lady in this land, and now she is despised and forsaken. Alas, what lady liveth in such misery, such heavy scorn and bitter pain? It is clear from this piece and other similar pieces of writing that was circulating at the time of Jane's death that her reputation was already being carefully crafted by those who disliked Henry VIII and saw him as tyrannical. He was known to have ordered the execution of Sir Thomas More, who he suspected of treason, and he had broken with the Roman Catholic Church and made himself supreme head of the Church of England. So it's understandable why people might not have been keen on him. However, with Jane, the situation was slightly different. She had died at Hampton Court in October 1537, just 4 months after giving birth to Prince Edward. So anyone still living in 1554 would have been able to remember her, or at least know about her through stories from people who had lived during her lifetime. Given that she had died so recently, her memory was still very green. And since Henry was still alive, albeit in poor health, they had to tread a little more carefully when attacking her directly. However, in exile, he became a much easier target. When he was dead, one of the things that people enjoyed doing was dredging up old scandals and reimagining them in new and exciting ways. And this was certainly the case with the Seymour family. You've probably noticed by now that there are very few portraits of Jane from during her lifetime. One of the reasons for this is that if you were commissioned to paint a portrait of someone, you didn't really want to offend them or their family, so you tended to avoid painting controversial subjects. In 1563, one of the writers of a chronicle of English history wrote the following about Jane, who he refers to as the late Queen Jane. His words, and I quote, "So soon as King Harry came to himself and found he had lost his wit in the disappointment of his hope, he sent for the Lady Jane Seymour, then in much favor with the Duke of Norfolk, and others, who was a woman of incomparable beauty, well-bred and able to advance herself, and presently married her." End quote. This statement about Jane being able to advance herself is completely unfounded and serves only to slander her name. There is zero evidence that she had an affair with Henry while he was married to nor that she did anything untoward to get ahead. Indeed, as we discussed in episode 5, it seems likely that Henry broke off his engagement to Anne of Cleves because he didn't like the way that she looked when she turned up at his wedding, and he immediately got cold feet and decided that he wanted to marry someone else instead. The fact that Jane was willing to go through with the wedding and actually did marry him shows that she was innocent in the whole affair, and yet the chronicler has tried to paint her in a bad light. Another writer was a bit more scathing in his views about Jane. He wrote a book called The Image of Both of the Sexes in 1579, and in it he refers to Jane as a, quote, light woman. We can see here that he also claimed that she had been one of Henry's mistresses before he married her, which again is completely unfounded. The truth is, there was no scandal attached to Jane's name when Henry married her. His first two wives, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, had both been executed, and he needed a third. Jane fitted the bill. She was young, beautiful, and available. What scandal there was at the time was surrounding the annulment of his second marriage, and it was all to do with him. Henry had never had a problem with Jane. He liked her for exactly who she was, and that's why he married her. A final portrait of Jane, which dates to the mid-16th century, was commissioned by Jane's nephew, Sir Thomas Bridges, and hung in his house at Scotney Castle. It's currently held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Notice the symbolism in this painting. Jane is shown holding a rose, which was a Tudor emblem, and a white rose. The white roses represented the House of York, and this could be seen as a nod to Henry Esther's desire to unite the houses of York and Lancaster. Her dress is also heavily embroidered with Tudor and personal emblems, and these include pomegranates, which signified fertility, a reference to her role as a mother to Henry's long-awaited son. There is also a lily, which was associated with purity, and a crown, which showed that she was queen. Thomas Bridges clearly loved his aunt and wanted to show her in a positive light, and he certainly achieved that in this portrait. But this was hardly something that Henry had done during his lifetime, and it is that which has led many people down the years to believe that he was unfond of Jane. In reality, he had treated her extremely well and would have been happy to have her in a portrait if he had commissioned one. He simply didn't have the money at the time, and his priorities lay elsewhere. Finally, we need to discuss one of the most famous portraits of Jane, which is a drawing by an artist. This piece was completed around 1536, so it predates Jane's death by a year, and it's the only known drawing of Jane that was made while she was alive. It's held in the British Royal Collection and has been reproduced countless times. Here we can see Jane wearing one of the French hoods that were fashionable at court at the time. Her hair is dressed in the latest fashion and she's looking very serene. Some people have pointed out that this drawing bears a striking resemblance to the Mona Lisa, and there is definitely some merit in this claim. The pose is almost identical. However, I don't think that Holbein was copying Leonardo da Vinci here. Instead, I believe that they were both copying a much earlier portrait of a woman named Cecilia Gallerani, who had been the mistress of the Duke of Milan. That painting is now lost, but there are several copies of it, including one which hangs in the National Gallery in London. I believe that Holbein came across one of these copies and decided to use it as inspiration for his drawing of Jane after all. He had worked in Milan in the early 1530s and would have been familiar with Italian art. Holbein's drawing is incredibly accurate, and it would have been easy for him to make mistakes in the heat of the moment. But he knew Jane well and had been in her position before. He was the man who had painted her into the center of one of the most famous Tudor artworks of all time. And in that painting, the March of the Month, Jane is surrounded by the symbols of fertility, power, and royalty. Clearly, even during her lifetime, Henry wanted Jane to be seen as important, and she played her role with aplomb. Sadly, she wasn't around for very long, but her legacy lived on. The Victorians loved a good martyr, and so they took the story of Jane Seymour and ran with it. They created a mythos around her, building her up as an angelic figure who died a horrible and slow death for her beliefs. This isn't true, as we've learned in my previous video, but it makes for a good story. Jane has become a legendary figure, the third wife of Henry, the one who gave him his son and then died. She is often forgotten in favor of the more salacious tales of Henry's other wives, but without her he may never have fulfilled his wish for a male heir, and may never have been able to secure the Tudor dynasty. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll be back next week with the final part of this series. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Henry VIII had 6 wives, but only one of them was executed. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to look at Jane Seymour and compare her to some of the other wives of Henry VIII. Jane is often portrayed as the one wife of Henry that he truly loved and who died tragically shortly after giving him his long-awaited son, the future King Edward VI. But how accurate is this portrayal? How did Jane fare when compared to some of the others? What might she have done differently if she had lived longer? Let's find out. Before we begin, I just want to say a quick thank you to our sponsor for this month, The History Hack. If you like this video, you can get a free history book by heading over to the website below. You can also get a free trial. Now let's get into it. We've already discussed in previous videos how Henry fell in love with Anne Boleyn and wanted to marry her, despite being told that their marriage would produce no legitimate children. And while many people assume that this was because he simply couldn't accept the idea that he could be denied something that he wanted, there is more to it than that. Henry really believed that he and Anne were destined to be together. He saw their relationship as ordained by God. In fact, he went so far as to claim that their bond had been forged in heaven itself before they were born. Henry truly believed that he and Anne were soulmates, and this, more than any other reason, is what led him to break away from the Catholic Church and marry her. By contrast, when Jane Seymour entered Henry's life, he was convinced that she was the woman he was meant to be with all along, and his feelings about her were much more grounded in reality. It is clear from his letters to her during the time that they courted that he was genuinely fond of her, but they don't suggest a deep or passionate love, nor do they indicate that he felt their bond was somehow preordained by God. What they do show is a man besotted with the idea of having a sweet, submissive and obedient wife who will give him an heir. And in Jane, he found everything that he was looking for. Unlike Anne, Jane wasn't brash and outspoken. She didn't make Henry feel inadequate, and she never challenged him or tried to assert any power over him. And unlike Catherine of Aragon, Jane didn't come from a royal lineage and therefore had no claim to the throne herself. Henry never had to worry that she would try to put one of her own children on the throne ahead of his. Furthermore, Jane wasn't interested in amassing power for herself or exercising any influence over the kingdom. She deferred to Henry on every matter and showed no interest in worldly things. These qualities made Jane easy for Henry to control, which is exactly what he wanted. But they also made her exceptionally unlikely to ever challenge him or stand up to him in any way, even when his behavior was unreasonable or cruel. Unlike Catherine, who famously refused to give up her claim to the throne and spent years pleading her case to the Pope, Jane meekly accepted whatever Henry decided, even when it meant that she lost her position as queen. When Henry began to take an interest in Cleves, Jane didn't raise any objections and instead wished the king happiness, even though it meant that she would be replaced as queen. Similarly, when she heard that Henry had ordered the Lady Rochford and her brother, George, to be put to death, Jane didn't speak out against him. Instead, she accepted her ladies-in-waiting as faith without complaint and went on to help secure their property and incomes for life. On top of being submissive and obedient, Jane was also quiet and reserved. She wasn't interested in grand displays of wealth and power, which made it easier for Henry to keep her under his thumb. For example, while Catherine of Aragon liked to live large and in doing so asserted her power and status, Jane preferred to live modestly. Catherine frequently complained about the cost of living in England and spent freely on food, clothes, and entertainment. Jane, on the other hand, kept a tight rein on her expenses and often donated her excess funds to the poor. Another way in which Jane differed from Catherine was in her choice of friends and advisors. Unlike Catherine, who surrounded herself with intelligent and influential women, such as Elizabeth Lady Shelton and Mary Queen of France, chose to spend time with those who were subservient to her and offered her no real guidance or support. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, on the other hand, were powerful and well-connected women who acted as her eyes and ears around the court. They helped her to navigate the treacherous waters of royal life and kept her informed of the latest gossip and news. Jane's ladies-in-waiting, on the other hand, were young, inexperienced, and easily manipulated. They were also loyal to Henry and eager to please him, which made them even more useful to the king than Catherine's ladies had been. And this brings us to another difference between Jane and Catherine, namely that Jane was willing to do anything to please Henry, including betraying her friends and turning on Catherine herself. While Catherine had been suspicious of Jane from the beginning and refused to accept her into her household until the last moment, Jane was quick to forgive her and welcome her in. Then when Henry began to turn against Catherine and accused her of disloyalty, Jane jumped at the opportunity to condemn her former rival. This betrayal would have been less shocking if Catherine had been a proud, headstrong woman like Anne, but it was particularly upsetting coming from someone as meek and unassuming as Jane. In the end, it was Catherine who came off best out of all of Henry's wives, despite the fact that she was twice rejected by him, refused to accept his annulment, and was vilified by him, his children, and the entire country. She managed to maintain her dignity and good name throughout her ordeal. Even her enemies had to admit that she was a good and pious woman who had never done anything to deserve the treatment that she received. Jane, on the other hand, was never particularly well liked by anyone, even though she was generally regarded as being harmless. Many people thought her to be cold, hard, and materialistic, and she had few mourners at the time of her death. Now, while this comparison may make Jane seem like a weak and vacuous person, it's important to remember that she was undoubtedly smart enough to realize that resistance was futile. Henry was determined to rid himself of Catherine, and he wouldn't be swayed by anyone. Jane knew that trying to stand up to him or argue her case would only make matters worse, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. By acting submissively, she saved herself and her ladies-in-waiting from certain ruin, and in doing so, she secured a place in history as the only wife of Henry VIII to bear him a son. Had she lived longer, she might have become the most powerful woman in England, controlling her young son and using him to further her own interests. But this is mere speculation. After all, Jane was perfectly happy to be a figurehead and let Henry make all the decisions, as long as he was content with her. Oh, good people of YouTube. Welcome back to another Royal Bloodline series, where today we shall look at the descendants of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, or should I say the Seymours, for that is what they were known by. But before we start, let me give my usual warning. This will contain major spoilers from the previous episodes, so if you haven't watched them yet, please do so to not be confused with this video. And also don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. Thank you. And now on with the show. Part 14, the Seymour family. Now before we delve into the Seymour family tree, I must tell you about the siblings that Jane Seymour had. But for those of you who have been with me since the start, you already know this. But just in case you haven't, here goes. Jane had 3 siblings, 2 sisters and 1 brother. Her eldest sister was Mary Seymour and her youngest Elizabeth. And then there was their brother, the infamous Edward Seymour, who would later become the Earl of Hertford. Yes, Edward Seymour. Now he was Jane's younger brother, and like her, he was the child of Henry VIII. Edward's life began on October 27, 1537, making him around 6 years younger than his older sister Jane. He spent much of his childhood in France, studying to be a courtier like many young nobles did at the time. When his sister Jane became Queen of England, he would return home and serve her as her principal secretary, which he would continue doing until her death in 1537. After Jane's demise, Edward was granted a noble title in her memory, becoming the Earl of Hertford. He was there with his sister Jane when she gave birth to Prince Edward, and it was he who cradled the child after he was born. When King Edward VI came to power, he appointed his cousin, Edward Seymour, as Duke of Somerset and Lord High Treasurer, the highest position that could be given at the time. However, Edward the King was very sickly, and it didn't take long for his counselors to tire of having to babysit him. So they removed Edward Seymour from his position and sent him to the Tower of London for treason, where he died soon after. The Duke's son, Sir Edward Seymour, who was barely 19 at the time, was also executed for his involvement in a plot to kidnap King Edward. In fact, Edward II's son was only spared the executioner's blow because he was too young when the crime was committed. According to the laws of the time, a most peculiar law, the Seymour family had actually fallen out of favor before Jane's death, but she had always protected them. As we know, her brother, the Duke of Somerset, got into trouble with King Henry and had to flee to France for a while. When he returned, he was summoned to meet the king in anger, but he refused and instead sent his wife, the Marchioness of Dorset, to go in his place. You can imagine how that went. Needless to say, he fell further out of favor with the king. Lady Jane Grey was also distantly related to the Seymour family, being the daughter of Henry's sister Mary and her husband, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Thus, upon Henry's death, when Lady Jane Grey took the throne for 9 days, Edward Seymour served as her Lord Chancellor. But once Mary Tudor came into power, the Seymour family fell yet again out of grace and Edward had to flee to France. There is some debate over whether or not Edward Seymour was married. Some sources state that he wed Catherine Parr, who would later become Queen of England, the 6th wife of Henry VIII, and that they had a son together named William. However, other sources claim that he was not married and that William was the illegitimate son of Henry VIII and Catherine Parr. There seems to be more evidence supporting the latter theory. However, so we come to the end of the Seymour male line. But what of the females? Well, let us begin with Jane's eldest sister, Mary. She was born in 1536, which made her the child of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, along with Jane and Edward. Mary was sent away to live with her aunt, the Duchess of Norfolk, and grew up with little knowledge of her true parentage. When she was 16 years old, she was sent to France to marry the future Charles IX, Duke of Suffolk, and they had 5 children together: Mary, Queen of Scots, Henry, Charles Brandon, Anne, and Elizabeth. Upon her father's death, Mary returned to England and became the Marchioness of Dorset. She held the position of governess to her niece, Princess Elizabeth, for a short while, but she disliked the job and passed it on to her sister. Catherine Parr, Mary's only daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, needs no introduction, as she has been featured several times in this series. Mary was married 4 times and had 6 children, although only one of her sons, James, survived infancy. Mary's granddaughter, Elizabeth, Queen of England, was the daughter of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Lord Darnley. Mary was executed in 1587 at the age of 44 on the orders of her cousin. Queen Elizabeth I, Mary's great-granddaughter, was the daughter of Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. They had 2 children together, Robert and Edward, both of whom died in childhood. Ian's great-granddaughter Elizabeth was the daughter of Queen Elizabeth I and the Earl of Essex. However, her father was executed for treason and her mother soon after fell ill and died. Elizabeth had no issue and thus died, ending her bloodline. Jane's youngest sister, Elizabeth, was born in 1540. She was sent to live with her aunt, the Duchess of Norfolk, and grew up knowing full well who her parents were. Unlike her older sister, Mary, she had a happy childhood and received a wonderful education. At the age of 15, she was betrothed to her cousin, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, but the wedding never took place. Elizabeth lived a life of luxury and privilege, traveling all over Europe and collecting jewels and fine clothes. She was quite wealthy and used her money to fund plays and operas. She never married though and died in 1603 at the age of 63. Elizabeth's daughter, Penelope Devereux, was born in 1565 and was the daughter of Elizabeth Seymour and Robert Devereux. Second Earl of Essex, she married Sir Robert Heath, and they had 2 sons together. Penelope's grandson, Edward Seymour, was the son of her daughter, and Heath, and George Villiers, 1st Earl of Buckingham. He inherited the title of Earl of Hertford upon the death of his father. In 1626 he married Elizabeth, the daughter of Sir Thomas Littleton, and they had 3 children together, and Elizabeth and George, his son, George, died in infancy, and married John Hollis, Earl of Clare, and they had 5 children together. Elizabeth married Richard Weston, Baron de Clifford, and they had 3 children together. Anne's great-granddaughter, Elizabeth, was the daughter of her daughter, Anne Hollis, and Roger Boyle. Elizabeth married William Russell, Duke of Bedford, and they had 1 son together, William, who died in infancy. Elizabeth's great-granddaughter, Elizabeth, was the daughter of her daughter, Elizabeth Ord. Elizabeth married John Manus, Earl of Rutland, and they had 2 sons together. Their son, John, died in infancy, but their other son, Francis, inherited the title of Earl of Rutland. So this brings us to the end of today's episode and to the end of the Seymour family. We started this series 8 episodes ago, and now we are on episode 14. Can you believe it? It feels like we've been going for years, but we still have 1 more episode left. Just 1 more to go. But for now, I must say goodbye. It has been an absolute pleasure sharing this journey with you all, and I hope that you have enjoyed it so far. If you have, please remember to hit that like button and leave me a comment in the description box below. I love reading your comments and replying to them whenever I can. Please also make sure to check out my social media accounts, which I will link down below, so that you can keep up to date with all of my uploads. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, bye. Part 15, The Last Queen of England. In Part 14, we saw how, after years of planning, Jane Seymour finally gave birth to a long-awaited son and heir for Henry VIII. But as we also saw, this victory was short-lived, and Jane died soon afterwards, having secured her place in history as the only wife of Henry to give him a legitimate child and thus a direct heir. But what else did Jane achieve during her lifetime? What kind of impact did she have on the wider world around her? And how is she remembered today? Jane's impact on the Tudor dynasty is obvious and undeniable. Without her coming to England and marrying Henry, there would have been no Lady Jane Grey, no Queen Elizabeth I, and possibly no union with Scotland under a Tudor monarch ever. For it was the lack of an heir that caused the English throne to pass to Lady Jane Grey after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Even though Elizabeth had no children and 3 legitimate siblings who also had no children, it was Jane Seymour's son, King Edward VI, who started the whole dynastic mess by attempting to name his cousin Jane as his heir instead of his elder sister, Mary, and then dying at the age of 15, having done just enough damage to cause civil war between Catholics and Protestants, Mary and Jane. But Jane's influence went beyond simply giving Henry an heir and causing future problems by dying. During her brief time at court, she managed to be a stabilizing force for the king. Even though she was young, only 28 when she married Henry, she was much more mature than he was. She understood the value of playing the game of court politics, and although she could be sweet and deferential to the king, she was unafraid to speak her mind or stand up for herself and the people she cared about. In many ways, Jane was the ideal queen, at least in the eyes of the English people, because she embodied the Renaissance ideal of the good, godly, and virtuous woman. In fact, she was so perfect that some historians have accused chroniclers of the period of making her into a kind of Mary Sue, an idealized character who can do no wrong. But while there may have been some exaggeration going on, especially after Jane's death, when people really needed a good queen to rally around, this image of Jane wasn't entirely a fabrication. She truly was a kind and gentle soul who took her role as a mother and a Christian very seriously. Jane was also the first Queen of England to die from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth. This was something that the English people at the time didn't really understand very well, and it caused them to believe that perhaps Jane's death was somehow connected to the fact that she had once been married to Guildford Dudley, a man whom Henry had executed for treason. This, in turn, caused them to view Jane not just as a martyr for their faith, but also as a victim of circumstance, which made her even more beloved by the populace. After her death, Henry went through a series of wives, but none of them were able to capture the hearts and minds of the English people like Jane had. He never stopped mourning her, and he kept her memory alive by having her portrait painted and placed in prominent locations around the kingdom, such as Hampton Court Palace. He also had her memorialized in the church where she is buried, and he commissioned a monument for her grave that still stands to this day. Today, Jane is remembered as one of England's most iconic queens, even though she reigned for only 9 months. Her legacy was secured by the fact that she gave Henry the son and heir he so desperately wanted, an heir who would go on to become the first Protestant monarch of England. Had Jane lived longer, she might have been a great and powerful queen in her own right. But as it was, her influence on English history was just as significant. Now, if you want to hear more about Jane Seymour, then I highly recommend checking out the series in the description below. These are the people who have made history.